In the last video, I talked a bit about how the idea of paper and paper making was transmitted from China to Europe, and that happened actually via the Islamic world. And in this video, I really wanted to expand on that material by discussing how paper really evolved and how its applications evolved within the Islamic world. So to start with, between the eighth and ninth centuries, it's important to keep in mind paper actually started to replace or really supplant papyrus and parchment, which were the previous mechanisms for recording data, in the context of record keeping and other governmental documents. So this was the first interesting application for paper. Okay, it continued to be used. For example, paper also played a prominent role in scholarly advancement. In particular, there was a place in Baghdad known as the Beit al-Hikmah, which stands for the House of Knowledge. And basically, this was a massive library in Baghdad, and it was built under the auspices of the Caliph. And at the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Knowledge, copyists and scholars actually took Greek texts which were written on parchment and papyrus, and they transcribed these texts onto paper while actually translating them into Arabic. So they were basically trying to acquire knowledge from their predecessors, and they eventually tried to improve upon that knowledge. Okay. Now, and I want to point out that aside from that simple transcription of works, there was actually a lot of scientific advancement, and paper did play a role as a very important catalyst for that scientific advancement. So, for example, the Islamic scientist Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and I'm going to spell his name out because he's a very important guy, al-Khwarizmi, actually wrote text, he authored texts on mathematics, and in fact, one of his texts introduced the idea of performing arithmetic operations using 10 digits. That's something that we do so commonly today that we might take it for granted that this was not how things were always done. So base 10 arithmetic, in many ways, was due to Al-Khwarizmi. He really figured out how to disseminate these ideas. And in fact, if you've heard the term algorithm, algorithm actually derives from his name. Al-Khwarizmi also wrote an early text on algebra. In fact, the term algebra comes from the Arabic term al-jabr, which means to balance. And so these kind of are indications of the prominence and importance that Al-Khwarizmi and other Islamic scholars played in inventions of the modern world, things that we know about today that we may not have realized came from these particular people. Okay? Now, aside from that, paper was also used for the dissemination of literature in the Middle East. So, for example, there was an instance found of excerpts from the earliest known copy of the famous work 1001 Nights, and that's the work. If you are familiar with the story of Aladdin, it comes from 1001 Nights, and as I mentioned, excerpts from the earliest known copy of this work were found in Egypt on light brown paper. So again, paper was being used to disseminate literature. So we can make a note of that. Literature. Okay. Paper was also used in other contexts. For example, it was used in religious manuscripts, and this was actually evidence. There was a book of traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and a copy of this book was found, and it was also on paper. It's actually considered to be the oldest surviving dated book. It was actually dated back to sometime around November to December of the year 866, and it was written on paper in Arabic script. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, even though religious manuscripts were one place where paper was used, there was actually one notable exception to that rule, or maybe one place where there was reluctance toward using paper, and that was actually in transcribing the Quran, which is the holy book for Muslims. And in particular, the Quran was typically transcribed onto parchment, which at that time was considered very durable, although it was very expensive to prepare. And so there was a reluctance towards using paper to transcribe the Quran. Now that actually eventually changed, and the oldest extant Quranic manuscript on paper dates back actually to around 971 to 972, and that was actually transcribed by a scribe whose name was Ali ibn Sadan al-Qasi. Okay, and maybe I'll make a note of his name here so you know it. Okay, now towards the end of the 10th century, an Islamic scholar, actually an Ismaili scholar named Nasr Khusra, was traveling in the bazaars in Fustat, or Old Cairo. So Nasr Khusra was traveling in Old Cairo, where he actually had spent some time. And what he noted was that paper was actually quite commonly seen in bazaars in Fustat or in Old Cairo, and that was a sign in his mind that paper had become much cheaper. It had become more of a commodity item that more and more people could afford. It wasn't, entirely cheap, but it had become something that could be disseminated to broader audiences, so to speak. And I do want to point out that Nasr Khusra was in Cairo itself from the years 1035 until 1042. Okay. Now, as paper became cheaper and increasingly available, it began to see other uses. For example, in the 13th century, we began to see paper take on a new role, and this was a role. And let me actually use a different color to describe this role. This was the role of architectural plans. Okay, and this makes a lot of sense if you are designing a new building or something. You need to come up with an architectural plan for it, and it would make sense to record that plan on paper. Now, this is not to say that architectural plans were never made available previously or were never written down previously, but it was not as common occurrence. And in fact, what would typically happen is builders often relied on things like oral transmission, they relied on memory, and so on and so forth. Now they could take that same information and they could transmit it using paper. Okay. Now, on a related note, paper also began to be used for other artistic endeavors. For example, to record designs in areas like metalwork, or even areas like textiles, and also ceramics. Okay, and previously, what would have happened is that such designs might have been transmitted orally, or maybe people relied on their memories. Now, what they could do is you could transmit these designs in books that comprise those designs, and then people could subsequently consult those books rather than having to rely on their memory or having to rely on some kind of oral tradition to do the same thing. Okay. Now, ultimately, in places like China and Europe, the importance of paper gave way to much larger scale manufacturing of paper, which in turn gave way to the development of printing. Now, one interesting note here from a historical perspective is that printing didn't prove to be as popular in Islamic lands, and there may have been some reasons for that. One reason is that the Arabic font contained a number of complexities that made it inherently difficult to typeset. Okay, and that was one reason. The other reason, which is interesting to consider, is that from a cultural perspective, calligraphers in Islamic society were afforded a great deal of respect, and theirs was really an art form that people were reluctant to relegate to a machine, especially when that machine wouldn't be able to produce results that were as aesthetically pleasing as compared to what human calligraphers could do. And in many ways, a machine would likely have produced results that looked inferior from many vantage points. Okay. Now, what is interesting though is that in Europe, these stigmas didn't exist, or they were less of an issue, so to speak. So, in fact, in Europe, and around the year 1538, Europe 1538, there was actually a copy of the Quran found. It was printed in Arabic script, and this actually happened in the city of Venice. Okay, and this was actually, again, as I mentioned, this was done in Arabic script, so it was an Arabic typesetting. Okay, and it took some time, but subsequently, in the 18th century, the first printing presses were set up in Islamic dominions, and in fact, they were set up in areas of Aleppo and Istanbul. Okay, and here the first printing presses were set up. They were actually set up with the help of the European, but they really brought the notion of printing to the Islamic world. And what's actually kind of intriguing here is that this dissemination and advancement of knowledge as a whole had really completed somewhat of a loop. The Europeans had acquired knowledge of paper through the Islamic world, and it was the Islamic world who in turn benefited from the knowledge about printing that was acquired from the Europeans. So there was a nice kind of quid pro quo here. So what I'll do is I will end this video on that note, and hopefully you found this series of videos on the Islamic world and the spread of paper useful.